In a few short years, the United States will mark its 250th anniversary as an independent nation. Today, it stands as a global superpower of 340 million people, built on the stated ideal that anyone can arrive on its shores and claim the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the land itself holds a much older history. For millennia before European ships crossed the Atlantic, the continent was filled by sophisticated indigenous societies, from the cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans in the southwest to the massive mound city of Cahokia near the Mississippi River. That reality collided with European expansion in the 17th century. British colonists established settlements at Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. They arrived driven by a combination of motives: investors seeking profits in the New World, and separatists looking for a place to practice their religion without interference. The demand for labor to cultivate lucrative cash crops like tobacco quickly led to the establishment of forced labor. In August 1619, a ship named the White Lion arrived in Virginia and sold the first documented enslaved Africans into the English colonies. From its inception, the American experiment contained a glaring contradiction. The pursuit of personal liberty and economic opportunity for early settlers was underwritten by the bondage of imported humans and the steady conquest of indigenous lands. This ideological tension became formal policy in 1776. Angered by years of British taxation without representation in Parliament, the 13 Eastern colonies declared independence, drafting a foundational document that explicitly promised liberty and self-governance. Following victory over the British, the new republic began an aggressive push west. Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, doubling the nation's size. By 1848, the U.S. military had captured Mexico City and forced the transfer of another 500,000 square miles of Mexican territory, stretching the nation's borders to the Pacific Ocean. Acquiring that land required the violent removal of the people who already lived there. Under the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the federal government coerced and forcibly expelled tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole from their ancestral homelands, marching them thousands of miles west so white settlers could claim their territory. In the Deep South, this vacated land was immediately converted into sprawling plantations. By the 1830s, cotton was the engine of the American economy, and it relied on a workforce of over 2 million enslaved African Americans. The United States was now fractured by its own geography. A rapidly industrializing North that had largely outlawed slavery was locked into the same national borders as an agricultural South dependent on forced labor. It was an economic and moral divide the legal system could not sustain. In 1860, the Republican Party won the presidency under a mandate to stop slavery from expanding into the Western territories. The election of Abraham Lincoln triggered immediate secession by Southern states, leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War in April 1861. Over the next 4 years, old military tactics collided with newly industrialized weapons. The resulting battles produced over 600,000 American casualties, ending only when Union forces systematically dismantled the Confederate Army and forced a surrender in the spring of 1865. The Union was intact, and by December 1865, the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery nationwide. But the promise of genuine equality for millions of newly freed Black Americans was almost immediately undermined. Following the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, former Confederate states rapidly built a new architecture of oppression. Through the terror campaigns of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the implementation of poll taxes and literacy tests, the South constructed a rigid system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow laws. The deadliest conflict in the nation's history kept the physical map of the United States whole, but it failed to resolve the core hypocrisy between the country's founding ideals and its daily reality. Despite its internal fractures, the United States was accelerating as an economic powerhouse. The completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869 collapsed coast-to-coast journey times from months to days, opening the interior plains to massive agricultural development and the extraction of coal, iron, and oil. This industrial engine required labor. Cities like Chicago and New York expanded at an astonishing rate, absorbing millions of new immigrants arriving mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe to start lives on factory floors and city streets. That unregulated economic momentum proved volatile. In 1929, the stock market collapsed, wiping out billions of dollars in wealth and plunging the nation into the Great Depression. Simultaneously, the agricultural sector was decimated by drought-driven storms that turned the southern plains into a suffocating dust bowl. Economic recovery arrived with the outbreak of the Second World War. The United States converted its factories into the greatest war machine in human history, supplying the Allied forces before ending the conflict by dropping atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destructive capability of nuclear weaponry, paired with an untouched domestic manufacturing base, elevated the country into a new geopolitical position. The isolated republic of the 19th century had been replaced by a global superpower. Through the remaining decades of the 20th century, the world was split into two spheres of influence. The United States positioned itself as the defender of democracy against Soviet communism, fighting proxy wars across the globe and pouring billions into technological prestige projects, ultimately putting a man on the moon in 1969. Yet, as it projected the virtues of freedom abroad, millions of its own citizens were still subjected to second-class status at home. It took leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. to ignite a nationwide civil rights movement that exposed the reality of segregation to the broader public. Through persistent boycotts, protests, and human endurance, the movement systematically dismantled legal segregation. This forced the federal government to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, legislation that brought the country closer to the rhetoric it had drafted in 1776. Moving into the 21st century, the nation's immense power continued to collide with new realities. The attacks on September 11, 2001, initiated a two-decade-long war on terror that tested the balance between national security, military intervention, and civil liberties. The history of the United States is not a clean, inevitable rise to glory. It is a continuous, messy struggle. Through conflict, settlement, and protest, it is the story of citizens forcing the nation to live up to the promise it made to itself 2.5 centuries ago.